Good morning. I'm Dave, and I'm so glad you're here with us today. I know that a lot of you have recently started new jobs and new schools, so this is the time of year when many people are trying to fit in with your new coworkers or classmates, figure out what it takes to succeed in this new environment, and if you're a Christian, how to align all of that with following Jesus. Even if you're in the same job, school, or situation as last year, a lot of us wonder about our calling and purpose in whatever place we're in. We don't want to miss a step and get left behind. We're afraid we might get passed over and miss the best opportunities, fail to reach our financial goals, or get left in the margins by the popular crowd. If we don't fit in and keep up, then we might miss out on the exciting life that we could have had. How do we balance the desire to fit in with the desire to make a difference that matters and do what God wants? Amid all the competing agendas and expectations, how do we even know what He wants for us? A lot of us are asking those questions, and though it may not seem obvious at first, I think we can find some interesting answers in the story we just read. Crowds were packing in to hear Jesus preaching, so He commandeered a nearby boat and pushed it out to the middle of a small cove so that more people could hear Him, kind of like a makeshift amphitheater. Simon, who owned the boat, had spent the whole night fishing. He'd only recently met Jesus, but already he'd seen Jesus do some amazing things. So even though he had other important work to do, Simon probably didn't mind Jesus using his boat. Maybe Simon believed everything Jesus was teaching, or maybe not. Commercial fishermen tend to be tough guys who work hard with their hands and risk their lives, and they're not the types to run after the next young rabbi spouting the latest ideas about God or religion or some other kind of lovey-dovey spiritual stuff. Even if Simon was interested in what Jesus was saying, he probably wouldn't have wanted to be too obvious to anyone else about that. He wanted to fit in, like a lot of us do. He didn't want to come off like some kind of Jesus freak. So I imagine Simon only half listening while he cleaned his nets. But when Jesus finished, he looked straight at Simon and said, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." And what followed must have been an awkward moment. Simon has to make a hard choice. Simon's been a fisherman on that lake his whole life, and he knows a thing or two about fishing. First, he knows that the best time to fish is between sundown and sunrise, because in the darkness, fishermen would drop their nets and then shine a lamp to attract fish to the light, and then scoop up the nets from beneath the fish and pull them aboard. Secondly, Simon knew that the best fishing is not in the deep part of the lake, but in the shallower areas, because unlike today's modern trawlers, they used smaller nets, so they could only reach the fish who were forced close to the surface by the shallow waters close to shore. On top of that, Simon's exhausted. He's already been up all night, and he's finally finished cleaning his nets so that he can call it a day, and now some preacher is telling him to push out again into the wrong part of the lake at the wrong time of day to fish with his freshly cleaned nets. And this creates some tension. Simon doesn't want to disrespect Jesus in front of everybody by ignoring his command, but neither does he want to look stupid in front of his fishing buddies, who'd probably laugh if they saw him trying to catch fish in the deep water in the middle of the day. Have you ever felt that tension between obeying Jesus and fitting in, when obeying Jesus might make people snicker or make you miss out on something good? The tension between your integrity and keeping up when everybody else is bending the rules to get ahead. The tension between playing gossipy office politics to secure your place and trusting God to take care of you. The tension between fitting in with your friends and following Jesus when those are at odds on a Saturday night. The tension between tithing faithfully and being generous and the desire to save a little more for your own security, retirement, or a few well-deserved perks. The tension between the call to forgive those who sin against us and the fear of getting walked all over by someone who isn't punished enough. Really, it all comes down to that tension between trusting Jesus and protecting yourself from the very real dangers and threats around us. Jesus is asking Simon to do something inconvenient and strange. I have to imagine there was a long pause before Simon finally answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I'll let down the nets." Even after he said it, I can imagine a silent dialogue going on inside Simon's mind. "This is so ridiculous. Why am I doing this? I must look like an idiot. Put out into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Keep your day job, miracle man, because obviously you know nothing about fishing. This just isn't the way it's done." But contrary to all logic and expectations, Simon ended up catching so many fish that they needed to call in another boat to help. The text says that he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John and the sons of Zebedee and Simon's partners. So they pulled up their boats onto shore and they left everything and followed Jesus. Simon took the risk of trusting Jesus when it might have made him look silly. And his surprise, Simon experienced unexpected blessing, and it captivated everyone who saw it, and it drew them to Jesus. And I tell you this story because 9 weeks ago, we began studying Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus calls us to live in ways that everybody knows don't make any sense. If you're meek, others will just walk all over you. And if you're merciful, they'll just keep walking all over you. If you try to be righteous or pure, you're going to miss out on the best pleasures. If you try to make peace when you see problems, you're going to end up in deep water, which coincidentally is exactly where Jesus instructed Simon to go. But living like that just doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's dumber than fishing in the daytime. You'll probably end up getting persecuted for it. In these Beatitudes, Jesus is calling us to live in a way that may make us uncomfortable or unusual, that may make others think that we're foolish or naive. But Jesus has promised that it will lead us to lives that are truly blessed. And just like Jesus knows a lot more about fishing than professional fishermen do, so also Jesus knows a lot more about love, joy, peace, and purpose than any of us do. Referring to the accumulated effect of beatitude living, being peacemakers, pure, merciful, mourning over our sin and the injustice in the world, and so on, Jesus said that not only will we be blessed, but also that we'll be a blessing, which he calls being salt of the earth. And I admit that at first, that doesn't sound very special. You know, a pound of salt costs less than $1. McDonald's gives it away for free. And doctors warn against using too much lest we raise our blood pressure. Why would we want to be salt of the earth? But back in Jesus' day, people thought about salt very differently. In desert societies, people needed salt to survive, and it was used for so many vital functions that most ancient cultures valued it more than gold. So it became a universal currency, such that soldiers were often paid in salt, which is actually the origin of the expression, that someone is worth his salt, right? The English word salary comes from the Latin word salarium, which refers to payments of salt. What makes salt so special? Lots of things, actually, because salt changes whatever it touches. Pastor Aaron from our Salem church joined me on vacation this summer and cooked eggs one morning. But after cracking the eggs, he salted them and then set the bowl aside for 15 minutes. He took a cooking class and learned how salt changes proteins at a molecular level by altering the ionic interactions between the amino acid residues. Okay, I have no idea what that means, except that in the end, it makes meat and eggs taste better because it literally changes them from the inside out. Just like it changes the freezing temperature of water to melt your icy driveway. Now that would be enough to make me impressed with salt, but there's much more. In ancient days, salt was used to treat injuries. Now, alcohol was also used this way, but that was much too heavy to carry, so armies and nomads almost always use salt to heal wounds and stop infections. It's still used that way today in many parts of the world. And sometimes we gargle with salt when our throats hurt. In addition to its medicinal properties, salt was a preservative that kept food from rotting. In the days before refrigeration, people salted meat or fish to prevent decay until they were ready to eat it. People also used salt for seasoning. Today, we have easy access to different flavors for every meal. But in those days, most cultures subsisted on one primary grain, like rice, wheat, or cornmeal, all of which are terribly bland. Without salt to make it palatable, it would be difficult to continue eating the same monotonous food. Even the Bible acknowledges, is tasteless food eaten without salt? I refuse to touch it. Such food makes me ill. For all of these reasons, salt was very precious indeed. So when Jesus claimed, "You are the salt of the earth," the ragtag group of regular people listening would have understood that he was saying, "You're very precious. You can nourish, you can heal the world's wounds, stop its decay, and give it flavor. If you live in this countercultural way that I'm describing, you'll change everything and everyone you come in contact with." Jesus thought salt was something special, and I completely agree. I love salt. When we're at restaurants, people regularly comment on my excessive salt consumption. If it won't pour for it fast enough, I often unscrew the top so I can just, get all the salt I want. But salt also makes you thirsty, which is probably why people also comment on how much water I drink at those same restaurants. And if we're salty in the way that Jesus means, we're going to make people thirsty too. When I started meeting some Christians as a teenager, they surprised me. I assumed that Christians were repressed and naive, missing out on the best stuff in life. But these Christians were alive in ways I'd rarely seen. They experienced love, joy, peace, forgiveness, and true community in ways I envied. Some of their habits seemed dumber than fishing in the daytime. You think forgiving, putting others above themselves, reading the Bible, and praying. It was so weird to me back then. But they were like salt. Life was more flavorful around them. And they made me thirsty for something more. They made me thirsty to know Jesus. My friends, Jesus says that we who follow him can be the salt of the world, which means that we're very precious. But it also means that we have a job to do. Our job is to nourish others, to heal the world's wounds, and to make life taste better. We can't just stay in the salt shaker. We need to follow Jesus out into the world. And for centuries, this is exactly what Christians have done. In the pre-Christian Roman era, Christians rescued unwanted babies who were thrown into rivers until they pressured the government to ban infanticide entirely. In England, Christians campaigned successfully to stop the slave trade. The Red Cross and most orphanages, adoption agencies, and hospitals around the world have been founded by Christians because they were willing to follow Jesus into the deep part of the lake. And it brought healing where there was hurt and changed the world. I've been fortunate to know many salty Christians over the years. People who heal others and make us thirsty for Jesus. I met one Christian like that when a group of high rockers traveled to India together years ago. His name is Obed, and though he grew up in the northeast edge of India, which is linguistically and ethnically distinct from the rest of the country, he had traveled down to Bangalore in the south to attend Bible college. But while he was there, his homeland was overtaken by terrorists who killed everyone in their path. So families spent all the money they had to save their children by putting them on a 42-hour train trip to the only person in their tribe they knew who was living outside the area, Obed. Children as young as 18 months were put on trains with signs taped to their chest explaining that when they arrived in Bangalore, someone should call Obed to come get them. Eventually, Obed had 32 children, in addition to the 3 he already had with his wife. No one else would take them because the children looked different and they spoke a different language. So finally, Obed and his wife adopted all those children. Because even though it was crazy for a million reasons, it seemed to be what Jesus was calling them to do. Our team visited twice with Obed and his large family in their apartment that would be considered too small for an American family of 4. And we were deeply moved because Obed had followed Jesus out into the deep water in a way that few people would try or think is reasonable. But like he surprised Simon, Jesus surprised them there with unexpected joy. I was personally challenged by Obed's example. My wife, Michelle, and I had 3 children whom I loved deeply. But I told her that while I'd always provide a home to anybody who needed it, I didn't want to pursue adoption anymore. I knew that Michelle loved the ministry of parenting and is amazing at it. But children are expensive, and having more children would seriously impact our lifestyle. It would mean that our house would be more crowded, and we'd need a bigger car, and have less money, less privacy, less free time, less sleep. I didn't want that, which seemed very reasonable to me. And most people would agree that 3 kids is plenty. But when I saw Obed sacrificing to love these children and serve Jesus, I realized that I'd bought so much into the middle-class American dream that I wasn't willing to sacrifice to serve Jesus. I had a stable job and a happy family and a comfortable home, so I didn't want to rock the boat. Like Simon, I didn't want to venture into the deep water. I didn't want to drop my nets that were finally fixed and finally drying. I didn't want to be inconvenienced or do anything too unconventional. And I think that's the attitude that Jesus warned against when he said, "You're the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, it's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." Now, technically speaking, salt can't lose its saltiness. Sodium chloride is a stable compound. But in Jesus' day, salt was collected from the Dead Sea, where crystallized salt formations were contaminated with other minerals. Since the actual salt was more soluble than the impurities, the rain washed out the salt, so what was left still looked like salt, but was worthless because it had lost its saltiness. So it no longer had any value as medicine, preservative, or seasoning. At that point, the only thing it was good for was to throw down on paths where the salty residue would kill vegetation and keep grass from growing in the paths, which is what people did in the days before Roundup was invented. And Jesus was warning that the same thing can happen to Christians and to churches. Well, they may still look like salt on the outside, but when they stop living beatitude kind of lives, they lose that distinctive quality that enables them to heal wounds, nurture life, stop infections, or add flavor to the world. We expend so much effort trying to fit in at our schools, workplaces, or neighborhoods, and yet Jesus called us to be different so that we can make a difference. That was the invitation that excited so many of us when we first started following Jesus. But too many Christians and churches today have had our saltiness flushed out by materialism, lust, greed, and self-centeredness. We've conformed to our culture. We want to be just like everybody else and buy what they buy, watch what they watch, enjoy what they enjoy. And we don't want to miss out on anything that the world has to offer. I don't want to show mercy. I don't want to sacrifice for purity or generosity. I don't want to make peace. I certainly don't want to be persecuted. I want to be normal. I want to be liked. I want to be accepted and successful. We may still look like Christians on the outside, but inside, we've lost our saltiness and are no longer good for anything. And all of this may seem very reasonable to everyone else around us. They may even appreciate it because salt can sting a bit as it heals. So we fit in and try to stay safe in the shallow part of the lake instead of following Jesus into the deep water. But something dies inside us as we do that. And we wonder why life is so much less fulfilling and joyful than Jesus promised it could be. In some ways, I'd become one of those Christians. I couldn't see it until I spent time with Obed. But I wanted to continue as a Christian without sacrificing my middle-class lifestyle or looking strange in the eyes of others. Paul, who'd grown up wealthy himself, warned Christians in Romans 12, don't conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. Paul suggests that I can't really know God's will so long as I'm committed to conforming to the world and becoming just like everybody else. I'll never know what God really wants for me or experience transformation unless I start asking different questions and seeking different dreams. And God used Obed to help me do that. He and his wife had given their lives completely to Jesus. They laid their preferences and schedules, finances, and futures on God's altar as living sacrifices so that God could use them however He wished. And seeing the way God used them to nourish and heal and spice up otherwise sad lives made me long for something more in my own life. Obed made me thirsty to follow Jesus more fully. I came back from India asking different questions. My mind had been renewed. And I think that's why, when we learned that a single mom in our church needed some help that winter, we invited her and her son to live with us for 6 months. It was unconventional, but God used it to bless all of us. My mind had been renewed and my heart was being transformed so that I could see God leading us in ways that I didn't have the eyes to see before. And I think that's why, when I received an unexpected email the following summer, I reacted differently than I might have before. Out of the blue, a high rocker emailed me about 3 Congolese kids whose parents had been killed and had lived on their own in a refugee camp in Uganda for the past 7 years. Finally, the United Nations brought them to the United States, but they needed parents and a permanent home. That high rocker asked if there was anything I could do to help, and normally I would have deleted it and moved on. I mean, I can't solve every problem in the world. And I got lots of crazy emails each day. So, delete, along with the $1 million from the widow of a Nigerian businessman, delete. But something grabbed my heart. So instead I forwarded that email to my wife and I began to pray about it. I began to wonder if Jesus might be inviting us out into the deep part of the lake to do something strange. I worried about what it would cost in terms of money, privacy, freedom. But I also suspected that Jesus was probably asking very different questions than I was. Instead of asking, why me? I began asking, why not? I began asking if we could. And I knew that we could. We Americans are among the wealthiest people on earth, much more than Obed in India, who adopted more than 30 children. Now, I couldn't do it without a cost. But the cost was so small compared to what Christians are doing all over the globe. I began to ask if this might be the Lord's call. How do you know if it's the Lord's call? Well, you can't know until you've been transformed and begin asking the right questions. God won't tell you His will until you're willing to obey whatever He tells you. And once you're asking the right questions, God's Word is a great place to start looking for answers. And in His Word, God is constantly talking about caring for orphans. In James 1:27, God says, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." So I asked to meet those three kids. I just wanted to get to know them. So I asked some non-threatening questions. Through a translator, I asked about what sports they enjoyed. And then I asked if they had their own room, what color would they paint it? And then I asked what they'd put on the walls. I assumed they'd say something like, posters of soccer stars. But the oldest one, in broken English, replied, "Cruz." A cross? I asked. And he looked me straight in the eye, almost as a challenge, because that's what they'd been killed for in Africa. And he said, "Cruz, we Christian." And that was the moment I knew that Jesus was inviting me out to the deep part of the lake. But I still hesitated because I feared how it might affect our lifestyle. I still love that middle-class American dream. After those kids left, I asked my children what they thought we should do, and they insisted we must bring them into our family. But I wanted to help them count the cost, so I warned them that this might mean never having your own bedroom again, and fewer gifts on birthdays, and probably never taking a family trip on an airplane again. Who can afford to fly with 6 kids? But they still wanted to do it. So I asked why. And then 10-year-old Victoria Upton, who was with us that day, replied, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, "I just know that if both my parents were killed, I'd want someone to do that for me." And my heart was pierced. Here I was, the pastor, wanting to protect my free time and convenience, while this 10-year-old is reminding me what following Jesus is all about. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans in their distress. And Matthew 7, "In everything, do to others what you would have them do to you." If we're Christians, we're supposed to be different. We're not supposed to conform so that we think like everyone else, act like everyone else, want what they want, or make decisions in the same way they do. We're supposed to nourish the world, heal its wounds, and stop the infection. Jesus was inviting us to the deep part of the lake. So just 3 days after meeting them, those kids came home to live with us forever. This photo was taken the next morning, which was the first day of school, so all the kids had to dress up for it. And I assembled them in front of our house for the traditional first day of school photo. And as they lined up, one of our new sons put his arms around the children on either side of him and shouted joyfully, "We family!" And my heart melted. And that afternoon, I joined Michelle to pick up the kids from school. And as we walked home, Michelle and I stood behind our snow-white son, Noah, and our dark black son, Neo, as they held hands and talked excitedly all the way home in different languages. I was seeing God's kingdom, and it was beautiful to watch. Our family has learned so much through this experience, but mostly we've learned that when Jesus invites us to the deep part of the lake to do something hard that might even seem stupid to people around us, rather than argue or look for a way out, we just say yes, eager to see how Jesus is going to surprise us with blessings and bring healing to others, just like he did with Simon that day on the boat when he finally had the courage to trust Jesus instead of insisting on fitting in or staying safe and doing what everybody does. Among other things, we've said yes to adopting 11 children now, and there's no doubt we're in the deep water now. Sometimes I've feared that we're going to drown. But my experience has been that Jesus blesses us there in ways that are beyond what we could think of to ask for or imagine. Paul says that when we stop conforming to the world, when we stop believing the world's lies about what will make us happy, when we stop believing that a little more time or a little more money or a few more exotic experiences, approval from others, or a little more freedom will finally be the key to fulfillment we're looking for, when we're transformed so that we start asking different questions and obeying different orders, then we'll be able to test and approve what God's will is. Not His challenging, unpleasant, unfulfilling, have no fun at all will, but His good, pleasing, and perfect will. What God wants for us is good. And while the world may promise that we can find a blessed life or get the very best things in an easier way, God knows a few things that others don't know. And He has the power to keep His promises. Michelle and I have experienced that God's will is often different from the world's ways of doing things, but truly is good and pleasing and perfect. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's easy. There are many challenges, which is why I appreciate that Jesus warned Simon, don't be afraid. That's a very important warning, because in our day, it's hard not to be afraid. It's hard to read an article on finances and not be afraid about how I'm going to pay for my kids' education or afford retirement, afraid that I'll miss out on the best things. And that's how the world washes the salt right out of us, by making us afraid. When salt loses its saltiness, it's just sand. It's good for nothing. When Christians lose our distinctiveness, we lose the ability to ward off decay, heal wounds, or inspire thirst. When Christians become just regular middle-class people, when we conform to the world, we have nothing to offer the world anymore. We're good for nothing. So Jesus insists, do not be afraid. Have the courage and faith to follow Jesus, even when it might be difficult or make you seem a bit different, and send you out to the deep water. After they saw what Jesus could do through one person who obeyed Him, He invited the other astonished fishermen, don't be afraid. From now on, you'll fish for people. So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed Him. They wanted Jesus to do through them what He did through Simon. As a church this year, we're deliberately cultivating our conscious dependence on the Holy Spirit, intentionally listening to God together, and committed to follow wherever He leads us. Our overseers and staff have already changed the way we operate so that we can start asking different questions and following Jesus in new ways. What would it mean for you to stop being afraid so that you can follow Jesus, so that He can serve and save through you? I'm not saying you should adopt 11 kids. That's probably not God's call to you. But He probably is calling you to something. Whatever it is. I'm sure that you have a million reasons why it'll never work, and everyone around you would think that you're strange for even trying. Do not be afraid. Don't conform to the world. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is for you. His good, pleasing, and perfect will. What is God calling you to do? Maybe God's calling you to lead a small group, even though it feels scary. Maybe He's calling you to give money sacrificially in a way that limits your lifestyle. Maybe He's calling you to finally deal with your porn addiction or some other secret sin. Maybe He's calling you to share what you've seen in Jesus with your friends, or family, or coworkers. Maybe He's calling you to fight for your marriage when it's difficult. Maybe He's calling you to invite over the neighbors for dinner so that you can begin building relationships, or get involved in a ministry that will eat up some of your precious time. Maybe He's calling you to forgive and seek reconciliation with someone you've been avoiding for too long. Maybe He's calling you to make a career change that will require trading making money for making a difference. Maybe He's calling you to adopt kids with special needs, have kids, or not have them, so that you can follow wherever He's calling you. I've been so inspired by the way many high rockers have had the courage to follow Jesus out to the deep part of the lake, to do things that might have seemed strange or scary. And I've been so encouraged by the way Jesus has used their obedience to bring them and others healing, blessing, and new life. You are the salt of Arlington, Cambridge, your college, your company, your family. And that means you are very precious. But it also means that you have a purpose there. You need to be different so that you can make a difference. Salt that loses its saltiness because it's been neutralized by materialism or sin can't nourish or heal. It's not salt anymore at all. It's sand. And it's so bitter that nothing will grow or flourish there. So, church, we need to ask new questions. Not simply what will be convenient, normal, comfortable, or safe, but what will be meaningful, make peace, and bring God's kingdom a little closer so that other people can see Jesus and experience His love and power. We need to ask not just, will it hurt? But will it heal? Thank God Jesus asked the right questions. When it was time to decide whether or not to sacrifice His life for us, Jesus was afraid too. But thank God that He didn't just ask, will it hurt? He asked, will it heal? So Jesus said yes to His Father's call. And it changed the world. What might God be calling you to do today? Are you afraid? I pray that God will call you out to the deep part of the lake and that you will have the courage to follow. And I pray that God will use your life and this church to be salt that heals, nourishes, and makes people thirsty for Jesus.